The ideal in which everything is winning intelligently all the time is represented by the sphere. And the sphere is both one, an integrated ecology and a symbol of the feminine, and infinite, reflected in the infinite planes or the infinite dots that as distinct particles or lines come together to form the sphere. You can make a sphere with a billion, a trillion, a quadrillion number of dots or planes, or it is the unbroken one. The higher consciousness of vast numbers of lines, particles, and distinctions is too big for the conscious mind to grasp. The conscious mind is a collection of distinctions. The conscious mind relates to reality through differentiating the whole through the lens of language, and then attempting to reconstruct a map of that whole, a map of that one ecology through a system of paradigm, a system of ideas that are expressed in language. Now, the system of articulating reality, the map of reality, is not reality. Words and the human consciousness that comes out of words is a map. And the crudeness of that map leads to the amount of perceived suffering. When you have a very crude map, maybe 4 different distinctions in the map, the sphere is broken into right angles. And while the lines may seem relatively easy to transit through, when you get to those right angles, it's an abrupt turn, unlike the grace of the sphere. And so human suffering is the byproduct of the angles introduced in a simplified and often asymmetrical, crude rendition of reality. Now, the sphere is too big, too complex to be conscious of. And so, in order to progress within human consciousness, we need to rely on a map of reality, a system of symbols. And that map, its complexity, its symmetry, its balance, determines how much we perceive the winning, the grace of the underlying ecology, the underlying wholeness that we are each a part of and emerge out of. So we're in that system world, the world of systems created through language. And every system, every framework of reality that a human mind can comprehend, can track, is flawed. First, it's flawed in its simplicity, leading to harsh angles, which, if you can imagine going on a roller coaster from a sphere into a roller coaster of angles, those transit points, bring friction because the energy wants to flow in a spiral direction with grace. But that's unconscious. It's beyond what a human mind can grasp. So it goes through the system that is constructed, the paradigms, the ideas, even words. They're not complex enough to capture the ineffable of that infinite number of dots and planes that recreates the whole in masculine terms. Now, the system can be balanced and symmetrical but crude, and in that process will take us on a complete revolution of the sphere, just jerking a little bit at the transit points. The system can also be in integrity with the underlying reality, or it can be flipped. You can redefine the associations with the word love, for example, to where love now means pain. So it's flipped. You've got polarity going on. But you can also create a chauvinistic model of reality that is asymmetrical, where one part of the circle, one part of the whole is deified and elevated, and another part is sublimated and demonized. The framework of chauvinism consists of breaking the sphere into its constituent polarities and then elevating. In our cult, it's elevating yang energy and demonizing and diminishing yin energy. It's elevating giving and diminishing receiving. It's elevating speaking and diminishing listening. It's elevating teaching and diminishing the rank within the cult of learning. And so the system is not only crude, but it's asymmetrical. Whenever you try and transit energy through an angular and asymmetrical system, you end up with suffering. In the same way that if you cut off the wheels of our cars into angles and then had half wheels with partially developed other half, we create a very violent and traumatic ride. Now, within the system of winning, we have a progression of intelligence, a progression of mastery. It begins with lose-lose. It's obviously not a very intelligent protocol if everyone involved loses. This progresses to win-lose, where this part of the circle wins while this part of the circle loses. And since the underlying framework, the underlying truth of the sphere is ecological, is interconnected, we have a moderate level of intelligence where there is a perception because we identify with part of the circle and disown the other part of the circle. We have a perception of victory by elevating the right hand and diminishing or suppressing the left hand. And this is called win-lose. As we move closer and closer to the ideal of win-win, it requires a higher and higher consciousness. And consciousness is refracted in language. If we pause for a moment and try and think of a single human thought without language, it can't be done. The thought is created with language. And the more sophisticated, the more complex the language, the more sophisticated and complex the consciousness produced by the creation and comprehension of that language. And the more comprehensive and symmetrical that language, the more it includes and moves towards the wholeness. That is the healing of the ultimate wound, which is the separation between the left half and the right, the yin and the yang, the light and the dark, the up and the down, the masculine and the feminine. These severing, the injection of masculine energy, which is the particle, which is the line, into the feminine energy, which is the unity in the sphere, creates the wound. But it's a very crude wound when you start by one becomes two. And as masculine energy evolves, as human consciousness evolves, first descending into the crudeness of distinction, the knowledge of good and evil, the knowledge of the two halves, it begins a long process of development of that masculine energy into more and more distinctions, into more and more particles of consciousness, out of which the whole gradually reappears within the consciousness framed within language. And we come back to the place that we began and know it through the construction of lines and dots, and know it for the first time. The unconsciousness of the whole that is yin returns to the consciousness of the whole that is masculine. And a revolution, one pass of the circle, of the sphere, has occurred. And on that journey, it takes higher and higher consciousness, more and more distinction, more and more particles. The higher refers to the mathematical numbers. If you just have two halves or two lines and you put them together, or three lines and you have a triangle, it's a crude rendition of the sphere. It's a level 3 in consciousness. If you can simultaneously hold billions of planes, billions of dimensions, billions of words in symmetry, to recreate that whole through language, you have a billion level of consciousness, a consciousness of holding a billion separate pieces of the whole in relationship with one another. And we start to see the one again when they are placed in just the right order. So as we move towards winning, the more parts that we consider in the puzzle of winning, the more complex the consciousness that is required to construct a protocol, a shape, a pattern, in which everything and everyone wins. Now, the sphere is the archetypal shape for that ideal of winning because it is the most elegant, the most graceful. It takes less energy, which is the continuum of intelligence. It takes less energy to transport energy through the shape of the sphere than any other shape in geometry, which is the symbol, the mathematical, spatial symbol for this metaphor, for this map of understanding reality. Now, of the 10,000 cults in human history, the 10,000 languages, the 10,000 belief systems, the 10,000 norms that anthropologists outline as ways in which people agree to interact, to speak, to think, to live. Of the 10,000 cults in human history, all of them have contained some element of unnecessary suffering. Those such as the cults in the Caribbean, which were stumbled upon by the Spanish, looking for India, looking for America, looking for the New World, had far more grace than our own culture, far more winning, far more sustainability than our own in terms of the masculine-feminine balance. Little or no violence, a tremendous amount of equity between men and women, no need for a police force. If we look at the sustainability principle, which is part of winning, because if in order to win, the ecology that supports you has to lose, you're not winning for very long. It's a cancerous relationship. Cancer rapidly consumes the body, and it wins. The protocol of cancer wins up until the very moment its host body is killed by the cancer. At that moment, where the cancer wins, the body, the host, the underlying ecology dies, and the cancer is dead a few days later, because the cancer depends on a living host in the same way that human beings depend on a living planet. It takes more intelligence, the kind of intelligence we found in the Native American tribes, who at the moment of their death left less than a kilogram. In fact, left absolutely nothing that was not biodegradable. And their bodies, being placed in the earth, brought nitrogen and fertilizer with no toxicity back into the ground. Within a year, the plants had consumed the body that was once a Native American Indian. And so it takes more skill, it takes more intelligence to live in a way where more and more of the ecology wins, flourishes, thrives as a result of one's dance. It takes very little intelligence to kill one's host body in order to enact the dance of a limited consciousness that defines winning in opposition to the larger ecology that gives rise to our own life. There are a couple of other distinctions that are useful in understanding this framework of winning. Just as each individual is a representation of the probability field, that is, the human species, meaning there is no human being who is alive today or who has ever lived or who will live that does not exist in the mathematical field of probability. Before something can be actual, it first must be possible. Before it can be actual, it next must be probable. And before it can be actual, it then must be enacted, realized on part of that continuum of probability. Every human being exists somewhere on that continuum, which includes as many matrices and metrics to observe and measure that pattern of energy as the human mind can create and conceive. We can look through an infinite number of paradigms, and through each paradigm, certain things are brought into focus and measured. Through the paradigm of chauvinism, one might see the imbalance of insisting on masculine energy and dominance. But if we look through the paradigm of strength as defined by masculine energy, then as we move towards symmetry, in one paradigm, climbing the continuum of symmetry, we descend and lose rank within the metric of force and dominance. So, in many ways, intelligence, measured by the efficiency with which energy is transformed into sustainable well-being, in many ways, intelligence begins with the paradigm, and it continues by breaking through the either-or of paradigm. You're with us or you're against us, to a both-and. Because in order to perceive the sphere on all of its many dimensions, all of the legitimate perspectives, you have the flipped perspectives where love is defined as hate and hate is defined as love, so the mathematics don't add up there. But all of the valid perspectives are necessary in parallel, in the same way that to get a full picture of the Earth, you don't argue when someone on the South Pole says it's cold and someone at the equator says it's warm. If you pick one or the other, you lose perspective on the whole, that is the planet. Meaning the greatest truth has no argument with anyone's legitimate experience. The full complexity of heat and cold, a typhoon happening on this part of the planet while it's pleasant weather on another part of the planet, the whole is composed by integrating and synergizing with every authentic perspective on the entire planet at any given moment. Meaning if you really want to perceive the Earth, What you want is 8 billion people all saying what's true about the continuums they are measuring at that time. And if you accept a both-and paradigm rather than an either-or competition, then every single one of them has a valid set of data that, in the embrace of, leads to a more complex rendition of the immense diversity on every metric on the surface of just one of billions of planets in the universe that are estimated to have the potential for giving birth to life. Now, just as this is happening on the outside, the paradigm of the fractal, the paradigm of the hologram, reveals an insight of the individual psyche, the conglomerate of identities that exist within the ego, are a smaller scale of the entirety of authentic perspectives. I'm just differentiating authentic from being an accurate measurement of what one is seeing and feeling and thinking and believing and doing versus what happens when there's a flip. Because if one person is measuring how loving something is by how much survival, security, welcome, self-esteem is in the environment, and someone else is measuring how loving the environment is by how much they're being abused, they're not using the same language, meaning love has been flipped into abuse. And so you will get a fuzzy version of what's happening in that area when you include the data mathematically of flipped perception. But if you understand that it's flipped, then you can understand that there are forces within that environment that are flipping symbols. Shame is one of the biggest. And so the equation of how many people and how many species and how many regions of the planet are and are not winning is reflected in many ways in the microclimate, the micro scale of the individual psyche. You know, some of our more complex psychological cults in human history have been aware and spoken of the 1,000 faces inside each individual. The archetypal landscape of mythology is the color palette of the psyche. And the color continuum can be refracted into black and white, be binary. It can have 7 core colors. Most of our TVs are built out of 4 primary colors. So you just combine 4 base colors to create the other colors. 4,000 pixels an inch. All these different refractions of light. A computer with a typical chip today, which is the limitation of distinction, a computer can refract color into 240 million distinct colors. But the human eye cannot. It's beyond the complexity. Most of those 240 million colors are unconscious We can say that's green, but we can't see the million different shades of green. We need it to be a little bit cruder, which is why we talk about lower consciousness and higher consciousness, mathematically speaking. But within the self, there are refractions of identity that are built on the inside to allow the possibility of empathy with the outside. Mirror neurons go out and try and replicate the pattern of perception, the pattern of consciousness in another, and then create a small region in the self so that we understand that person. But how many of those parts on the inside, how many of the inner ages on all of that band of color, of probable selves, of actual identities built and designed to correlate and relate to our environment, are at a win-win level of intelligence. Because when you have a chauvinistic paradigm in which half of the world is better than the other half, then half of the identities and patterns of energy inside each one of us are treated better than the other half. And when you treat half of the psyche, half of the self, worse than the other half, you lose symmetry. Chauvinism taken to the extreme would involve brutalizing the left arm, the left side of the body, the left leg, and the left eye, and the left face, and bringing it down into a dysfunctional state, and then pampering and overdeveloping the muscles, etc., on the right side of the body, and then telling the human being to function, to run. Well, every time they took a step on the right side, it would be great, as long as their left side didn't give out in the process. Which is why the sphere is such a beautiful metaphor for intelligence, for grace, for well-being, because it reveals scientifically that the problem comes when we take half of who we are and dishonor it, disrespect it, and not even understand the basis of those ideas, which are built into language, which are built into older language. Spect is Latin to see. If you do not see something, if you do not respect something, you do not see it. It doesn't mean it's not there. It just means you bang into it violently because you didn't honor it. You didn't honor it. You didn't adapt based on what you saw because you didn't see. You didn't see because your cult is based on a disrespect, a lack of sight for that particular region inside and out. And so you have, as cult splits away from the sphere in a dogmatic and self-referential loop that reinforces itself at the expense of the science, because chauvinism doesn't work when you manufacture a battery, because nobody wants a battery that has just a few seconds of life in it, because the battery manufacturer was a chauvinist. and put 98% positive charge in the battery and 2% negative. The electricity is created by the synergy of polarity. So if you have 98% negative or 98% positive charge, it just means you've wasted energy for a weaker battery that drains faster. That's not intelligent. So we've split cult and science. When we want things to function, we use science. We use equality in the positive and negative charge because we want our batteries to last. But then when we come into the cult domain, maintained with a self-referential blindness, we ignore the science. And we maintain our identity in reference to the cult. And it's very difficult for children coming in because a child depends on the giants, the people around them. A child is completely dependent on their caregivers, usually their parents, for survival, for security of survival, for love and belonging, and for validation, which in time will become self-esteem as it's internalized and rebuilt. If you don't get those 3 or 4 basic human needs met by the cult around you, you die. And so an infant reorients from the science of their ecology to the dogma of the cult that will keep them alive on condition to conformity, on condition to the adaptation to the language, the paradigms of that cult. Now, once you've learned that you need to be part of your cult to survive, you'll die without it. Science and ecology become your enemy because the cult has diverged from science and ecology. So you're now in a split created by the chauvinism of the cult. Now you have to choose one or the other. Intelligence or collaboration with your cult. Ecology or collaboration with your cult. Science or the self-referential dogma of your cult. And the cult keeps you alive initially. It's very difficult and traumatic to break the contract of conformity because a cult exists with one goal: to perpetuate its own identity and to kill off, to repel, to reject that which would lead to its change, that which would lead to its evolution. And in doing so, there is a status quo, a stable identity. And we need that stable identity in the cult, which becomes the stable identity of the ego, in order to relate to ourselves, because the complexity of who we are and the complexity of our underlying ecology is too big to grasp. It's paralyzing in its chaos. And so the cult provides certainty, stability, at the expense of intelligence, at the expense of symmetry, at the expense of grace. And so we're in this conflict with ourselves, with our cult. And in that conflict, you see, the cult is based on chauvinism, racism, bigotry, classism. It's based on good and bad, with the idea that whatever is called bad is less than whatever is called good. And so there's an inherent war in that dynamic. And we didn't want to learn from the Native American Indians how to relate to our environment in such a way that when we died, there would not be a single kilogram of garbage, of waste. Waste is symptomatic of a low level of intelligence, because there is no waste in the sphere. Every single piece of the puzzle has an optimum place in the grace of the sphere. The illusion of waste is invented when human beings can't figure out what to do with something they created. A human being creates a shopping bag and then takes the bag home and no longer needs the bag. And a low level of consciousness cannot figure out what to do with that energy. And rather than say, I'm a low-level consciousness that doesn't know what to do with the energy I create, mentally, emotionally, and physically, I'm just going to reclassify that which I lack the intelligence to digest and reintegrate with the ecology as garbage. My limited thought pattern is not garbage. That which I don't know what to do with is garbage. And so the average American creates more than 100 tons. 100 tons. So we're talking, for every body, by the time that we die within the cult, we've got 1,000 times our own body weight of energy sitting in a big hole in the ground or incinerated to pollute the Earth's atmosphere with stuff that we created and then couldn't figure out what to do with. And so we burned it or dug holes in the ground and buried it. It's a low level of intelligence on a scientific level, but it makes perfect sense and it's normal at a cult level. Now, within the framework of the acculturated psyche, we have this phenomena of shame. Now, shame in its destructive expression is the conflation of the awareness of our lack of intelligence. Meaning, if we were perfectly intelligent, we would not hurt ourselves, we would not hurt our planet, we would not hurt other people at all. That's a perfect dance with all the patterns of energy mentally, emotionally, and physically around us. But we don't have that grace. And our culture slams into many of the instinctive forms of grace that we possess in birth and childhood, in our uniqueness, and punishes it because it's protecting its identity from distinction, from uniqueness, from change. And so the things that are met with fear, the things that are met with judgment, with scapegoating, with ostracization, with dissociation, with trauma, with abuse inside of ourselves are viewed as bad. And then our behavior is conflated with our being. So having decided that if you have anger, you're bad, or if you have hate, you're bad, or whatever it is, then there's the conflation of the being and the posture. There's no distinction in a psychologically illiterate cult. So now we have things being evoked by the cult and by the environment that are taboo. In a paradigm where if you have those things or are associated with them, you are those things. Because being is conflated with doing. So now you have a fear of being seen, because the cult produces large amounts of energy that it doesn't know what to do with and classifies as garbage. Now, we know that an American would produce 100 tons of garbage, energy we don't know what to do with physically. But that's a metaphor and a placeholder for the 100 tons of thoughts that we also create that we don't know what to do with, that we label as bad and problematic to be gotten rid of. And then we also produce 100 tons of emotional energy that we dislike, judge, disown. In other words, we produce 1,000 times our weight of energy, mentally, emotionally, and physically, that we don't know what to do with. And so we're afraid of it, we're ashamed of it. And the protocol of shame, the unloved, uncared for part in every psyche, certainly in our cult, is secrecy. Because if something is fundamentally unacceptable and unlovable, and you're in a sociopathic environment in which that which is unlovable is unloved and punished, the parts of us that have been transformed into unlovable don't stop needing survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem to develop. In fact, it's necessary for the sphere to function and reconstruct itself in its full grace. That every part, if you think of a very complex jet plane with more than 250,000 individual parts, if you want that plane to function with grace, and you decide that half of the propellers should be thrown out, and don't tell anyone that we made those propellers, and half of the fuel should be thrown out, and half of the rivets should be thrown out, the plane disintegrates. It loses coherence. Just like our minds lose integrity with themselves, go insane. In these two conflicting messages of the underlying reality in mathematics and the dogma of the cult backed by trauma, backed by threats to our physical, emotional, financial, logistical, and mental existence, if we don't conform, if we don't dissociate from parts of ourselves that are integrally linked to the whole. The persona, the identity, that is cult-induced shame, seeks survival through secrecy, to hide the underlying mathematics of the self and of the reality from a cult that lacks the integrity and the intelligence to own and integrate that which it has produced. For example, the cult produces large amounts of chauvinism, large amounts of trauma, large amounts of sexual abuse, large amounts of loneliness, large amounts of terror. The cult also produces large amounts of betrayal, dishonesty, hypocrisy, corruption, and reptilian behavior. A reptile, and each of our reptilian brains, fights and exploits that which is smaller and runs from that which is bigger, because that's how a crocodile survives. A crocodile doesn't look at a 5-year-old the way a Native American might and say, that's a cub. We don't attack the cub, and we don't attack pregnant mothers. We're in an ecological balance. And that young one will become a bigger one. A crocodile doesn't think that way and will attack a 5-year-old and leave a larger human being alone. It takes intelligence, it takes the empathic brain, and it takes rational thought, the pattern analyzing brain, to think like a Native American and say, we're not going to hunt the salmon when they're going upstream, because each of the salmon we kill when they're going upstream is killing 1,000 salmon later in the eggs. And for the ecology to be vital, we'll take 1 or 2 of those fish of the 1,000, but we will not interrupt the cycle of life on the salmon going up the stream. A sociopath, the reptilian brain, is incapable of that type of equation or empathy for itself or anything else. The reptile attacks whatever is weak. The empath protects what is weak until it can grow strong and deliver its gifts. The empath is a higher level of intelligence. So, in order for everything to win, you need transparency. You need complexity. You need algorithms that come out of the empathic and transcendent and rational brain that are science-based, which threaten the status quo of our cult. The norms that have as their primary goal the stabilizing of the norms, independent of their level of insanity. Insanity just means there's a very polarized and weak relationship between the behavior of one part of the self and the underlying reality, which is always the larger self. We are not separate from the earth. The earth feeds us energy through oxygen from trees, energy through water, through the oceans, energy through electricity, through the chemical interactions of the earth. Every single thing we eat, breathe, every object we have ever related to, including our own bodies, is inextricably connected to the larger ecology that gave birth to it. What we get to decide is whether we want a cancerous relationship with the earth, in which we feverishly destroy our host body in a polarized relationship up until the moment when we kill the ecology that gave birth to us and die a few minutes later. You know, the last tree to fall, we have a few more seconds of air and then done. There's nothing to create out of other than the larger ecology. And we lack the intelligence to create an ecology that is as complex as our own body, as complex as our planet, as complex as a carrot. The human mind cannot create a carrot. It can only take a part of nature that is a seed, mix it with another part of nature that is soil, mix it with another part of nature that's water, and another part of nature that's light and air. So we can watch nature and copy it, but we can't actually create a carrot. Only nature can do that. Only the larger body that gave birth to each one of us. Now, in order for every part of the self to win, the cult that the self resides in must restore its symmetry and complexity and sustainability in relationship with the whole. Otherwise, the level of intelligence that is the human being is in a win-lose paradigm. Either I do what's best for the planet, for mathematics, for the future, and have no money, and am ridiculed, and am viewed with fear, and am not enabled to survive, and this and that and the other. Or I side with my cult in a cancerous relationship with the host body, growing the cancer with the trick of language, because cults are self-referential. If you look at every single part of every single cult in human history, it could be improved. And in our case, just about everything could easily be improved by a factor of 10. But to make those improvements, you would have to acknowledge that there's something wrong with the status quo, that the status quo is in an asymmetrical relationship to its underlying ecology and mathematical field. You have to challenge the status quo of the cult in order to diagnose the disease produced and sustained by the cult. Now, a cult has one goal: to perpetuate itself and to attack threats to its pattern. The cult does not have a goal of aligning itself with intelligence or with ecology or with mathematics. All of those are solid paradigms to connect with. It has a goal of maintaining the integrity of its dysfunctional identity and attacking all threats to that identity, even when the identity is killing large members of its people, mentally, emotionally, financially, physically, and existing in a cancerous relationship with its underlying ecology, that which it depends on. And the thing to understand is that self-referential, dogmatic identity based on fear emerges out of trauma. The traumatized person, the traumatized culture, is frightened of the unknown because the unknown could lead to more trauma. It's frightened of the future because the future is unknown. It's frightened of change because change leads to the unknown, which could lead to trauma. And it's frightened of diversity and uniqueness of all forms, because the more diverse a culture is, the more vulnerable it is to change. All chauvinism, all racism, all classism, all of these isms are based around a traumatized identity of an insecure pattern of energy that has experienced the overwhelming force of the collision between the cult, between the people and the underlying ecology, the mathematics, and other people, is terrified of losing coherence, of losing identity, and is responding to that terror by digging in and holding on desperately to the very patterns of self-referential thinking, feeling, believing, and doing that doom every cult in human history. There were once in the history of the planet 10,000 different cults. 90% of them are dead, are extinct cults. There's no longer someone speaking that language, those beliefs, because the cult could not change with the environment any more than we can in a traumatized state. Before we can embrace a dance of co-creative, transcendent winning with the larger ecology of which we are a part, we must understand and learn to heal the personal and then the collective trauma that we have all experienced and are incompetent, too emotionally and traumatically illiterate to respond to. It is only the adult, the one who is capable of differentiating from their cult, that has the capacity to change, adapt, and dance with the vast complexities of our ecology in a way that is sustainable. The failure to do so guarantees the failure of every cult. ironically creating its biggest fear, when you will not change, when you hold on to your position in the face of more and more data, more and more evidence, more and more of reality, when you hold on position because you're afraid of death. The death of what? The death of your identity, your pattern, the loss of your position, of the unknown. When you hold on to that, you guarantee death. Because life evolves. Life passes through one revolution after another in the sphere. And what makes intelligent sense in the day is insane in the night. What made sense in the 1500s is suicidal today. What makes sense today is destructive tomorrow. Can we open to the dance with ourselves, to the dance with the mathematical field of possibility and probability, to the dance with the underlying culture that we are a part of? This is the only way to move from lose-lose to win-lose, to win-win within self-referential terms, within the terms of the cult, to win-win in more terms, in terms of the ecology and mathematics and the cult, and to continually invite more players to the table into a position. It is a shape. It is a structure of thought, of feeling, of behaving, into a thought, into a shape in which everything that we are aware of, which is a speck of a speck of a speck of all there is, wins. That is the journey.